Black waitress is mocked for her scars. Until a veteran is shocked to recognize the unit tattoo. The coffee was hot, but the stares were colder. As Alicia poured refills in her long sleeves, laughter rose from booth 4, mocking the scar on her wrist. She said nothing. But one man looked closer, and froze. Where are you watching from? World map, let me know below. Carl took a seat back at his corner, his mind spinning with the unexpected discovery. Alicia returned to her duties, but Carl couldn't shake the image of her scars and the quiet resilience in her eyes. He'd been to too many places, seen too many things, to miss the weight of what she'd endured. But why was she here? In this quiet diner, wearing long sleeves even when the heat seemed unbearable? The diner wasn't much, just a local spot that everyone in town knew. The faded booths, the crackling jukebox in the corner, and the soft chatter of the regulars who had made it their second home. Alicia had worked here for years, always pleasant, always professional. Yet Carl had never seen her truly connect with anyone. She was like the weathered walls of the diner, enduring but distant, a woman who had learned to survive, but not to be seen. As Carl sipped his coffee, he couldn't help but wonder about her story. What had she been through? What made her hide so much of herself? His curiosity grew, but more than that, it was the deep respect he had for anyone who served in the military that pulled him in. He needed to know her story, even if she wasn't ready to share it. Days passed, and Carl returned to the diner each morning, sitting in his usual spot. He'd chat with the regulars, offer a joke here and there, but always keep his eyes on Alicia. He noticed her exhaustion. It wasn't just physical fatigue from long shifts, it was a quiet, worn-down kind of tiredness, the kind you couldn't shake with sleep. Every smile she gave seemed a little forced, her gestures a little more mechanical. Carl knew that look all too well. One day, after the morning rush, Alicia came to refill his coffee. Her movements were slow, almost deliberate, and Carl noticed she had her sleeves rolled up just slightly, as if she had forgotten. For a brief second, Carl saw the full extent of the scars that twisted around her wrist, the marks of something deeper than the skin. His heart sank. This wasn't just about a battle fought with weapons, it was a fight for survival that went beyond the battlefield. He decided to approach her, gently. Alicia, I've been meaning to ask. I served in the 173rd Airborne. I saw your tattoo the other day. I was in Kunar province, too. A long time ago. Her eyes widened, the briefest flicker of surprise passing over her face. But there was no fear, no anger, just the same quiet strength that seemed to surround her. She leaned against the counter, looking down at her hands for a moment before speaking softly. I know who you are, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was with the 173rd, too. I was part of the team that helped evacuate civilians, when we lost so many. Carl felt a lump form in his throat. She wasn't just a waitress hiding behind her long sleeves. She was someone who had witnessed horrors, someone who had paid a price he knew all too well. He could feel the weight of the words hanging between them, an unspoken understanding that neither of them had to voice. They had both been to war, but Alicia's battle didn't stop when she left the field. It had followed her here, to this little diner in Georgia. The conversation between them was short but impactful. Neither of them spoke about the details of that terrible time in Kunar province. There was no need. The pain was too real, too raw to relive. Instead, Carl simply nodded and gave her a small, reassuring smile. Later that day, Carl watched as the same group of customers who had mocked Alicia walked in again. This time, Carl wasn't just a bystander. He was a witness to her strength, to the scars that told her story, and he wasn't about to let anyone belittle her again. As the customers began their usual loud banter, Carl stood up. His weathered face, lined with years of experience, softened into something resolute. He walked over to the table, his movements slow but deliberate. With a quiet, commanding voice, he addressed the group. You see that woman behind the counter? She's a hero. A soldier who fought for this country, who bled for it. And she doesn't owe you an explanation for her scars. Show some respect. The room fell silent. Alicia didn't look up, she just kept her back to the group, her head slightly lowered. But Carl could see her shoulders relax just a little, a hint of relief in her posture. The customers, now clearly embarrassed, fell silent. The leader of the group, a young man with a sheepish expression, muttered an apology. It was enough to make Carl nod and return to his seat. But his thoughts were elsewhere. It wasn't just about standing up for Alicia, it was about standing up for anyone who had carried unseen burdens. As he sat back down, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that he was only just beginning to understand the layers of her story, and that there was much more to Alicia than even she was ready to admit. If this moment moved you, please give the video a thumbs up. And if you've ever stood up for someone who needed it, share your story in the comments. What would you have done in Carl's shoes? The days went on, but something had shifted between Carl and Alicia. She still served him his coffee each morning, but there was a subtle change in her demeanor. A slight softness in her eyes, a willingness to engage in the quiet moments between their words. And yet, the heaviness still lingered, the kind of burden that couldn't easily be put down. Alicia wasn't just a waitress, she was a woman who had seen the worst of humanity, who had survived the chaos of war, only to return to a life that felt unworthy of her sacrifice. One afternoon, Carl walked into the diner to find the usual bustling crowd, but there was a tense air about the place. Alicia was at the counter, her back to him, her shoulders tense as she spoke to a man in a military uniform, not someone Carl recognized. The man was standing too close, his hand resting on the counter, his voice too loud, too persistent. Carl noticed the way Alicia stiffened. There was something in her posture, a quiet but unmistakable unease. Curiosity stirred within him, and without thinking, Carl rose from his seat. He walked over to the counter, placing a hand gently on Alicia's shoulder. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Alicia's eyes darted toward him, and for a second, there was something in her expression, a flicker of fear, or perhaps something deeper, more personal. She quickly masked it, though, offering him a small, forced smile. "It's fine, Carl. Just a misunderstanding." The man in uniform turned toward Carl, sizing him up. "You know her?" he asked, his tone condescending. "I do," Carl replied simply, his voice steady. "And I'd appreciate it if you gave her some space." The man laughed, clearly not taking Carl seriously, but there was something in Carl's steady gaze that made him pause. He looked at Alicia one last time, his gaze lingering too long, before turning and walking out of the diner, muttering under his breath. Alicia let out a quiet sigh of relief as the door closed behind him. She stood there for a moment, her back still turned, her fingers trembling slightly as she wiped the counter. Carl stayed silent, waiting for her to speak. Finally, she turned to face him, her expression worn. I didn't want you to see that," she whispered. Carl studied her carefully. What was that about? She hesitated, the words clearly not easy for her to speak. "It's nothing. Just someone from my past. Someone who doesn't understand that not everyone who wears the uniform has the same story. Not everyone comes back the same way." Carl's heart tightened. He'd been through his own battles, seen the way people struggled to find their footing after war, but this was different. Alicia wasn't just struggling with her past, she was carrying the weight of someone else's expectations of her, and she was tired. "I'm sorry," Carl said quietly. "You don't have to explain anything to me. But I'll tell you one thing, Alicia. Whatever you've been through, it doesn't define you. You're here now, and you're still standing. That's what matters." Her eyes softened, but there was still a flicker of something unreadable in them. She didn't respond at first, but Carl could tell she appreciated his words. The silence between them wasn't awkward, though. It was full of understanding, the kind of understanding that only comes when two people have shared something deeper than just casual conversation. As Alicia turned to leave, Carl placed his hand on her shoulder once more. "You're not alone in this," he said, his voice low but filled with sincerity. "You never will be." Later that evening, Carl returned to the diner, feeling the weight of his own thoughts. He couldn't stop thinking about Alicia's words. Her scars weren't just physical, They were emotional, buried so deep that even she seemed to avoid touching them. But Carl knew something that Alicia didn't yet realize. The only way to heal was to face those scars head-on. He sat quietly at the counter, waiting for her. When she finally appeared, she gave him a warm smile. She didn't need to say anything, and he didn't need to ask more. The connection they had was unspoken, but it was there, real and solid. As she poured him another cup of coffee, Carl leaned forward, looking her in the eyes. "Alicia, I've been thinking," he began slowly. "You don't have to carry it all alone. You've already done so much. Let someone help you carry the load. It's not about being strong. It's about knowing when to ask for help." Her hand paused, the coffee pot hovering above the mug. Alicia looked at him, really looked at him, as though she were seeing him for the first time. And for the first time in a long while, Carl saw something flicker in her eyes, a hint of hope. The days that followed were heavy, like the humid Georgia air that clung to everything. Carl could see the change in Alicia, not in her demeanor, but in the way she held herself. She was starting to carry less of that invisible weight. Slowly, quietly, Carl's words had begun to work their way into her heart, even if she wasn't ready to admit it. He noticed the smallest shifts, the slight relaxation in her shoulders when she spoke, the gentler way she smiled. But Alicia was still a woman of few words, and Carl knew there was more to her story than she was letting on. Then, one evening, as the sun began to set behind the diner, the storm finally broke. Carl arrived at his usual time, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. He sat at the counter, his eyes scanning the menu, but his mind was elsewhere. The air in the diner felt different, charged with something unsaid. It didn't take long for him to realize that Alicia wasn't herself tonight. She appeared at the counter, her face pale, her hands shaking slightly as she set a cup of coffee in front of him. But it wasn't the coffee that caught Carl's attention, it was the look in her eyes. She wasn't looking at him the way she usually did. Her gaze was distant, and her expression was one of quiet desperation. "Alicia." Carl's voice was soft, but firm. "Is everything okay?" She hesitated for a moment, then slowly sat down across from him, her fingers twisting nervously around the coffee cup. Her eyes were filled with something Carl had seen before in soldiers he'd met over the years, the hollow look of someone who had buried their pain so deep that it threatened to break free. "I can't do it anymore, Carl," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've tried so hard. I thought I could outrun it, outrun everything I've been through, but I can't." Carl's heart sank. He leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "What are you talking about, Alicia?" She swallowed hard, her lips trembling. "The things I saw, the things I did, they're still with me. They haunt me. I thought I could live a normal life. That if I worked hard enough, kept my head down, maybe I could forget. But every day, it's like I'm carrying a weight that no one can see, and I just don't know how much longer I can keep going." Carl's chest tightened as he listened to her. He knew the feeling she was describing. The weight of war, the unspoken trauma, it didn't just fade away. It left scars that no one could see, but they were always there, lurking just beneath the surface. Alicia had been carrying hers for so long, alone, without anyone to lean on. And now it was breaking her. "Alicia," Carl said gently, "you don't have to carry this alone. Not anymore." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away, trying to remain composed. "I don't know how to let go, Carl. I don't know how to forgive myself for what I've done, for the people I couldn't save." Carl's heart ached for her. He knew this battle was one she would have to fight on her own terms, but he also knew that she didn't have to fight it alone. "I'm not going to tell you that it's going to be easy," Carl said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'll tell you this, healing doesn't happen overnight. And forgiveness, well, that takes time. But you don't have to face it all right now. One step at a time. You're not alone in this. You have people who care about you." "I care about you." There was a long pause between them, and for a moment, the only sound in the diner was the soft hum of the refrigerator in the back. Alicia looked at Carl, really looked at him, as though seeing him for the first time. Slowly, a small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, but it wasn't just any smile. It was a smile that spoke of something deeper, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. "I've never had someone say that to me," she whispered. Carl placed a hand on hers, his touch warm and reassuring. "You don't need to be strong all the time. It's okay to let someone help you carry the weight." For the first time, Alicia seemed to truly exhale, like a breath she had been holding in for years. "Thank you, Carl. Thank you for seeing me. For not turning away." Carl nodded, his voice soft. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad you're here." As Alicia stood up to return to her duties, she paused for a moment, looking down at Carl. There was something different in her eyes now, a flicker of something she had buried deep within herself for so long. A flicker of strength, of healing, and of peace. Later that evening, Carl left the diner with a sense of quiet contentment. He knew Alicia's journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Maybe, just maybe, Alicia was beginning to see that she didn't have to carry everything on her own. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments. The air in the diner had changed again, but this time, it was lighter, less oppressive, more hopeful. Carl had seen the shift in Alicia over the past few weeks. She wasn't the same woman who had first walked into that diner with a distant, hidden pain. She was still guarded, still wearing her long sleeves, but there was something different in the way she carried herself now. The weight wasn't as heavy. She had started to open up, bit by bit, about the things she'd left behind in Kunar province, about the sacrifices she'd made, and the things she still needed to forgive herself for. It wasn't easy, but it was progress. One evening, Carl noticed something he hadn't seen before: Alicia was laughing. It wasn't forced, wasn't tinged with sadness or exhaustion. It was a full, real laugh, the kind that Carl hadn't heard from her in all the months he'd been coming to the diner. She was standing at the counter, chatting with one of the regulars, when the man told a joke that made her chuckle. It was so rare, so unexpected, that it caught Carl off guard. He smiled to himself, knowing she had taken another step, even if it was just a small one. But just as things seemed to be settling into a quieter rhythm, the world had other plans. That evening, a storm rolled in. The sky darkened, the wind picking up in gusts that rattled the diner windows. The power flickered several times, and the sound of distant thunder could be heard, rolling in like a warning. As the storm picked up, Carl sat at his usual spot, watching the rain lash against the windows, his thoughts drifting back to Alicia and the strides she was making. Then, the door swung open, and the man who had once caused Alicia so much discomfort, the soldier from her past, walked in. His uniform was freshly pressed, his demeanor unchanged. He scanned the room before his eyes landed on Alicia behind the counter. Carl saw the immediate tension that gripped her, her body stiffening as she noticed him. For a moment, there was silence. Alicia didn't move at first, but Carl saw her fingers twitch, the kind of involuntary movement someone makes when they're faced with something they want to avoid, something that brings back memories they're not ready to confront. Carl stood up, walking over to her side, his presence quiet but reassuring. "Alicia, it's okay," Carl said softly. "You don't have to face this alone." But Alicia had already made her decision. She set her jaw, straightened her back, and walked toward the man, her footsteps echoing through the diner. She didn't wait for him to speak. She spoke first. "I'm not who you remember," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I've done my part, I've paid my dues. And I've moved on. If you're here to make things right, you've missed your chance." The man looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Carl watched the scene unfold, not moving, not interfering. Alicia was standing her ground, and Carl couldn't help but feel a surge of pride for her. She wasn't the frightened, beaten-down woman she had been just a few months ago. She was standing in her truth. The man nodded slowly, his eyes softening. "I never meant to hurt you, Alicia," he said, his voice low. "I was just trying to do my job. But I see now, it wasn't just about the mission. I never saw what you were carrying." Alicia's eyes hardened for a moment, but she didn't break her gaze. It doesn't matter now. What's done is done. There was a long, heavy pause before the man sighed, his shoulders sagging. I can't change the past, but I hope you find peace. Alicia nodded once, a single tear slipping down her cheek. For a moment, Carl saw everything she had carried, everything she had locked away, in the quiet vulnerability of that one tear. But it wasn't sorrow that filled her eyes. It was a quiet acceptance, a sense of release. I'm finding it, she whispered. The man left without another word, and as the door shut behind him, Alicia took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Carl stepped toward her, giving her a moment to collect herself. You're stronger than you know, Carl said quietly. Alicia didn't respond immediately, but she didn't need to. Her eyes met his, and in that unspoken exchange, Carl knew she had taken one of the most difficult steps on her journey, and it had come not from him, but from her own heart. That night, as Carl sat in his usual spot, sipping his coffee, he realized that Alicia had already begun to heal. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm she had weathered inside herself, but she was stronger for it. And as the rain began to taper off, Carl felt a quiet, deep satisfaction. Alicia was no longer hiding in the shadows of her past. She had faced it head-on, and in doing so, she had started to reclaim her life. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. The storm had passed, but the calm that followed felt different, a kind of peace that only comes after a long, hard struggle. Alicia stood at the counter, wiping down the same spot for the third time, her mind clearly elsewhere. Carl watched her from across the room, the warmth of the diner now matching the newfound warmth in her spirit. It had been a week since the confrontation with the soldier from her past. The days that followed were quiet, but Carl could feel the difference in the air. Alicia had started to share more of herself, small details about her time in the 173rd Airborne, moments of her life before the scars. She didn't talk about the dark days as much anymore. Instead, she focused on the things that had brought her back from the edge, the simple, quiet moments that filled her heart with peace. Carl could see the healing in her eyes, even if she wasn't ready to fully acknowledge it. But there was something else that Alicia was still carrying, a sense of guilt. She hadn't forgiven herself for the things she had lost, the lives that had been lost in her care. And Carl knew that part of her would always struggle with that, no matter how much time passed. But he also knew that she was no longer trying to outrun her past. She was standing beside it, accepting it as part of her story, but not letting it define her. One afternoon, after a particularly busy lunch rush, Carl sat at his usual spot. The diner was quieter now, with only a few scattered patrons enjoying their coffee. He watched Alicia as she moved behind the counter, the familiar rhythm of her work comforting in its simplicity. She wasn't just serving food anymore, she was serving herself, too. She was beginning to take back pieces of herself that had been hidden for far too long. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting a soft glow across the diner, Alicia finally turned to Carl, a smile lighting up her face. It was different from the smiles she had given him before, warmer, more genuine. She wasn't just trying to be strong for others anymore, she was allowing herself to be strong for herself. I'm starting to believe what you said, she said quietly, her voice steady but full of emotion. Maybe I don't have to carry it all alone. Carl nodded, his heart full. No one should have to. The words hung in the air between them, simple but profound. They weren't just about forgiveness or healing. They were about the connection that had been forged between them. Two people who had both seen the worst of life but had chosen to keep moving forward, together. Alicia stepped away from the counter, walking over to Carl's table. For the first time, she sat down across from him, a full cup of coffee in her hands. She took a sip, then looked at him with a glimmer of something he hadn't seen in her before. Hope. I've been thinking about something, she said softly. Maybe it's time to move on, to let go of what happened in Cunor, to stop blaming myself for things I couldn't control. Carl met her gaze, his voice filled with warmth. You've been carrying that for a long time, Alicia. It's not easy to put down. But you've done the hardest part already. You've acknowledged it, faced it. The rest will come in time. She smiled again, this time with a quiet sense of peace. Maybe it already has. For the first time in what seemed like forever, Alicia didn't seem weighed down by her past. The woman before him was someone who had been through fire, but had learned to rise from the ashes. She wasn't perfect, and her journey wasn't over, but Carl knew she was on the path to healing. As Carl stood to leave that evening, he gave Alicia a long, meaningful look. She wasn't the same person who had walked into that diner all those months ago. She was stronger, braver, and more at peace with herself than she had ever been. "Take care of yourself, Alicia," Carl said, his voice gentle but firm. She nodded, her eyes filled with a quiet confidence. "I will, Carl. Thank you for everything." Carl smiled and turned toward the door, but as he stepped outside, he paused for a moment to look back at the diner. The rain had stopped, and the streets were glistening in the soft glow of the streetlights. Alicia was standing at the counter, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze soft as she watched him leave. It was a moment of finality, of closure, but also of hope. He knew she would be okay. And as he walked away, Carl felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had helped her, not by fixing her, but by giving her the space to heal on her own terms. If you've enjoyed this story, please like the video, comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartfelt tales. The story was complete, not just for Carl or Alicia, but for everyone who had ever carried a burden, for everyone who had ever struggled to forgive themselves. Because in the end, healing wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about learning to live with it, and finding peace along the way.